Colombia has walked a long path of violence to reach the prospect of lasting peace. Several decades of violent social conflict all began with the impoverished Colombian peasantry and their demand for better land distribution. But their desire for equality goes back decades before the formation of the FARC rebel group. Here's a look at the last 5 decades to where we are today. 1964. This was the year the FARC guerrilla group was born. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia wanted better land distribution among Colombians. During this volatile time, a second group, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, formed out of a desire for a more representative government. Both pledged to control half of Colombia with 15,000 armed men and women. Years of violence followed. 1984, the first peace attempt. President Belisario Betancourt established the first ceasefire and open peace talks with the rebels. It failed months later. 1991, a second try at peace. With the help of Venezuela and Mexico's governments, then Colombian President Cesar Gaviria started a conversation with the armed groups. The first meeting took place in Caracas, then near Mexico City. This also failed. 1995 saw the birth of paramilitaries. Several right-wing armed groups formed to protect the landowners and their properties from guerrilla attacks. This complicated the conflict in Colombia, and the groups became associated with drug cartels. Several leftist politicians were killed by paramilitary forces. 1996. Various paramilitary forces united and formed the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, or the AUC. 30,000 armed men came together and started the so-called death squads. 1998 to 2000, a third attempt at peace. President Andres Pastrana fulfilled his campaign promise to initiate talks with the FARC. 1 year later, the government agreed on a controversial demilitarized zone, or safe haven, for the rebels. Soon both sides exchanged prisoners. The FARC freed 359 captives, and in return, the government freed 14 guerrilla members. 2002 was known for high-level kidnappings. The peace talks were interrupted after the FARC allegedly hijacked a plane with a Colombian senator and his companions on board. The government ordered the FARC out of the demilitarized zone. Presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt and campaign manager Clara Rojas were also kidnapped and held hostage for years. Hundreds of people were killed during this period. 2003 to 2006, no negotiating. The conflict intensified as President Alvaro Uribe promoted the demobilization and amnesty of the paramilitaries. Around 30,000 gave up their arms and confessed to their crimes. During this period, the army was accused of killing around 3,000 civilians. Several military personnel were indicted, including relatives and cabinet members of Uribe. 2012, another shot at lasting peace. President Juan Manuel Santos tries again. His administration approves the Victims of Land Restitution Law. It provides reparations and restores land to the many displaced by the conflict. The FARC announces the end of kidnappings, and soon negotiations begin in Havana between the government and the rebels. 2014 to 2015, a deadline for peace. After months of talks, both parties reach a breakthrough on the major issues in September 2015. Re-elected President Santos met with FARC leader Rodrigo Londoño, also known as Timochenko. Both committed to a 6-month deadline to get a final deal signed. The FARC announces a unilateral ceasefire. 2016, the Colombian government announces a peace accord with the FARC. The signing ceremony took place on September 27th in Cartagena. Colombians voted on October 2nd in a referendum to ratify the deal. And the country's second largest guerrilla group, the ELN, decided to start their own peace talks. For more on the peace agreement and what lies ahead, we're joined by political analyst Laura Carlsen. She's been closely following the peace talks and negotiations since they began 4 years ago. Laura, welcome back to the show. What was the most difficult part of this entire peace process, or is it still yet to come?
Well, first of all, in these 4 years, what we've seen that took the most time was the most difficult was this last part, which were the sections on victims and ending the conflict. And it was most difficult because, first of all, with victims, you have years of atrocities to, in some way or another, atone for. There's a question of reparations. How do they get on with their life and recuperate some of what they've lost? And then ending the conflict, the biggest and the thorniest issue by far was a question of punishment. Who will pay for the atrocities that were committed on both sides, both by government armed forces and by the FARC? It's here that we've seen a lot of opposition to the agreement itself, with the feeling, especially by former President Uribe and his followers, that the FARC is not paying a heavy enough price for the years of warfare. But the agreements were possible because both sides came to the agreement that in order to move on, it was time to look for a way out, and that the conflict had to end. And most of Colombian society was also so sick of the war and the over half-century conflict that they were able to negotiate an agreement that was acceptable to both sides.
President Santos won re-election by promising a risky referendum, just as former British Prime Minister David Cameron did with the Brexit. Why did President Santos take this risk?
The peace process is extremely complicated, and it was very important for the government in order to know that it was going to move forward to have a popular mandate, to know that Colombian society, the majority, were behind this peace process. And that's why not only is there a plebiscite, but there's a quorum. There has to be a certain level of people who vote. The programs that are in place as a result of these years of negotiations are very complicated and require the involvement of the entire society. At the beginning, the FARC was against putting this requirement that there be a referendum at the end of the process because they didn't want to expose themselves, go into a peace process, and have, after years of negotiations, it be reverted by a popular vote and be back at step one. However, they were willing to concede that because of the commitment on both sides to the process. A referendum is a very risky thing. In Brexit, we saw the results of that risk, and this has been close. The polls have flip-flopped at times, but it was necessary in order to assure that the peace process could go forward with the support of society.
Laura, critics have called attention to the wording of the plebiscite and that the phrasing of it could have influenced a yes vote. If voters were specifically asked if they support a peace agreement with the FARC, they would likely be more no votes. So what have been some of the other concerns, especially in the agreement?
It's very unlikely that if the wording were different, the vote would be considerably different. After 4 years of negotiations, Colombians know what this is all about, and in fact, they're highly polarized in terms of their positions regarding the final agreement. The wording is, do you accept the final agreement to end the conflict for a lasting and durable peace? And it's a simple yes or no vote. And so people are going to go to the polls knowing what they're going to answer. The biggest problem is the problem of whether or not the FARC is being punished enough for the atrocities during the war. And there are many people that believe that there should have been a military solution, which is the complete annihilation of the FARC. However, after 52 years of war, many people had come to the conclusion that physical annihilation of the FARC was going to be impossible or was going to be extremely costly in terms of human lives, and for this reason, the government was willing to enter into the peace agreement. Making sure that the peace agreement sticks will be one of the major concerns in the future. The United Nations is going to be verifying the disarmament process, which will take place over a period of 6 months. One of the other concerns is how the FARC members are reintegrated into society and how they're integrated into the political process as they now go from being an armed opposition to a political party.
Describe for us a post-referendum Colombia. What happens next, and can FARC members really become true members of society?
The leader of the FARC, Rodrigo Londoño, was very clear in that they were laying down the arms and they were going through this transition to become a social force and a political force. There was no ambiguity in that intention, and the government has accepted their word on this. What the programs that are set up in order to reintegrate the FARC are very comprehensive and they're very difficult, no doubt about it. They have to convince communities to accept members of the FARC back into the communities. They have to create some 7,000 jobs for guerrilla members who will be reintegrated into society. And they have to carry out a number of training programs so that young people and older people who have spent considerable time in the guerrilla, in the armed forces, will be able to reintegrate in peaceful jobs that will contribute to society and to building the peace itself. All this is a tremendous challenge, there's no doubt about it. But if Colombia, with the support of the international community, takes up that challenge in good faith, then the entire world has a possibility to see a successful peace process, and that's a huge sign of hope.
Political analyst Laura Carlsen in Mexico City, thank you so much for joining us on America's Now.
America's Now